The middle class that was in Libya has been decimated. There was a middle class. There was one that existed under Gaddafi. As someone that despised Gaddafi myself, make no qualms about it. I'm not someone that would lie about the situation in 2011. There was a middle class in Libya. That has now disappeared.
Anas Al-Gomati. He is the founder and director of the Sadiq Institute. It's a think tank focused exclusively on Libya. And today, in a special edition, I have part one of my interview with Anas Al-Gomati, in which we discuss what is going on in Libya right now and what has happened over the last 15 years. Just this year is the 15th anniversary of the overthrow of Muammer Gaddafi and the civil war, basically, that broke out in the country with the Arab Spring, the armed insurrection backed by NATO, and we'll talk about that later on in this episode. First, I just wanted to talk about Iran a little bit and what has been going on there. Later on in this broadcast, I also have a couple of interviews I did with India's NewsX World about the latest in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. I'm confused. I don't understand the U.S. strategy here. You know, there's this American saying, I don't know if it works in British, having your cake and eating it too, which basically means that you save your cake in the fridge while you eat it as well. And you can't do that. But it seems like what the U.S. is doing is not having its cake, not saving its cake, throwing it out in the garbage and not eating it as well. It seems to be the opposite of that, because with its current Iran strategy, it is driving up oil prices, driving up energy prices, destabilizing the Middle East, risking that the Bab el-Mandeb, the strait, the narrow waterway that separates the Red Sea from international waters and is the access point to the Suez Canal that leads to the basically the point through which ships coming from Europe go to Asia without having to pass through Africa, that weeks-long journey through the Cape of Good Hope. That could be closed as well with the U.S. strategy right now of encouraging Saudi Arabia to hit at the Iran-aligned Yemeni Houthis. I'm Borzou Dergahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at borzou.substack.com. I'm also on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify and on YouTube. And I would ask anyone who is watching or listening to this show and enjoys it or finds it useful, if you could just comment or leave a couple stars or critiques either on YouTube or Apple iTunes, I would so appreciate that. Actually, I'm in Chicago now, and I was talking to my dad. He knows the Middle East a bit, and he was basically speculating that the Americans are just trying to degrade the ability of the Iranians to hit at ships in the Persian Gulf and in the Strait of Hormuz by attacking all of the military infrastructure along the coastline there. The problem with that whole strategy, however, is that you don't have to fire from the coastline. Yeah, it helps. You have line of sight from the mountain cliffs that are above the Strait of Hormuz, but you can also fire from 5 kilometers inland. You can fire drones or missiles. You can fire drones or missiles from 20 kilometers inland, from 100 kilometers inland. So the idea that you have to have access to the coastline, it just makes no sense. And it seems like what the Americans are doing is basically riling up the Iranians, giving them the idea that they're going to take the southern portion, perhaps with these hints about taking Kharg Island, take control of southern Iran. Let's see what kind of nationalistic fervor that inspires. They're angering the Iranians without actually making any kind of possible political change. And as a matter of fact, the political change that the Americans are somewhat guaranteeing with their current military strategy, which is a kind of a low-level bombing from afar, is to solidify the ability of the Iranian regime to mobilize people to defend against the country without actually affecting the performance of the country, without affecting the regime, without affecting. In fact, I think that what the Americans are doing right now is probably strengthening the regime. Look, I'm not going to advocate for regime change war. But if the Americans want to get the Iranian regime to open up the Strait of Hormuz without making any kind of substantial concessions to the Iranian regime, you're going to need to do regime change. The American regime should give up on this strategy of bombing with this kind of pinprick precision strikes on the southern coast. That is not going to do much in terms of changing the behavior of the regime. It might actually change it for the worse. There was a report that one of the targets that the Americans hit was a dormitory where Iranian conscripts were sleeping, and a bunch were killed. Now, these guys were sleeping. They weren't fighting. They weren't manning battle stations. Does anyone really think that that's going to get the Iranian regime to say, oh, wow, they're going so far as to hit young boys while they're sleeping, 19, 20-year-old conscripts that are basically forced to serve in the military. They hit them while they were sleeping. That's going to get the regime to buckle. No, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to get the Iranian nation mobilized, just as hitting the schoolgirls in the first day of the war in February and sinking that ship with a bunch of sailors that were, many of them musicians in the marching band of the Iranian Navy off the coast of Sri Lanka. That kind of action actually mobilizes the country. It actually whips up nationalistic fervor. The Trump administration is engaging in the worst of all possible policies with regard to Iran, the worst of all possible strategies. It's not hitting hard enough that it would cause some kind of substantial change to the regime. It's not willing to do that. It's not going to risk getting Iran to hit at the Persian Gulf energy infrastructure, for example, by targeting Iran's energy infrastructure. So the idea, I guess, is to degrade Iran's ability to attack the Persian Gulf by degrading these military sites and garrisons and bases along the Persian Gulf coast. And I just don't think it's going to work because of what I described earlier. So I'm not sure what the Americans are doing. And if you have an idea and you disagree with me and you think this is a brilliant strategy, or you have a different way of framing the strategy, I would really appreciate a comment if you're listening in, either via email or better yet, just post it on Twitter or post it on the Substack commentary, just if you're watching it on Substack or hearing it on Substack. Just put a comment as to what you think is going on here, because I'm confused. In any case, I recently had a couple of interviews with India's NewsX World in which we discussed the ongoing developments in the Persian Gulf, whether there's any hope of a return to diplomacy or normalcy, and what the impact of closing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait might have on the global economy. Please listen in or watch.
We've seen a very sharp escalation over the last 4 days, and it's been 4 consecutive days of US strikes against Iran. And what we're basically seeing is that both parties are now not willing to back down, because both view each other's actions as a violation of the interim MOU that was reached sometime back in June, which was a major respite to the entire world. Where do you see this conflict headed? Do you think both parties will come back to the negotiating table? Trump has on one hand stated that and threatened Iran to in fact come back to the negotiating table, but on the other he says that he's going to start targeting power infrastructure and bridges.
Yeah, I think that would be the next stage in the escalation ladder. And if the U.S. administration decides to target the civilian infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, as well as energy facilities, you'll see reciprocal action by the Iranians targeting energy infrastructure and civilian infrastructure in the Arabian Peninsula and in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, perhaps as well. And that will be very devastating for the world economy. This is really a game of who can withstand more pain. Can Iran withstand more pain, or does the United States have the capability of withstanding a real global economic crisis, which is what will happen if this conflict continues.
There are a lot of fears of crude oil prices rising, leading to a lot of inflation as well, and people's lives are being impacted by this. If this conflict does prolong, what are the consequences that I wanted to understand from you that the American public will face at large?
Well, I'm visiting right now the United States as it happens, and I haven't been here for a year. And just going to the supermarket here, you can see just how high the prices have gone up, how they've sharply increased 50, 60% higher for basic stuff like breakfast foods and fruit, and basic stuff like dairy products and so on. So I think that is one of the effects of this crisis. You saw the price of gas go down, price of petrol going down during the period of time when the Memorandum of Understanding was in place. Now you see the price going up, edging up as the oil prices are going up. And that's going to be more painful for the United States. Look, Iran doesn't have to deal with the same pressures because, frankly, it's not a democracy, right? They don't have to face elections for the system, so to speak. There is elections, but they don't really change the government. They don't really have a big impact. And in any case, those elections aren't happening this year. So that's basically the difference at this point, because Iran can tell its people to shut up and bear it, but the United States and the Trump administration don't have that ability.
Elections, they're practically on the anvil. Midterms are slated to take place in November. Donald Trump was voted to power by his MAGA voter base on a host of issues. One of the points that he continuously spoke about and criticized the earlier Biden administration on was the war funding. And now we're seeing that Trump itself is going and bombing Iran. How do you think this will impact his Republican voter base?
Well, I think that a huge significant portion of the base of support for Donald Trump has already evacuated. They've already checked out. There are still some supporters out there. There's a significant portion of the U.S. population that will support Donald Trump no matter what he does or what he says. They're just part of his cult, so to speak. But I think that it could be really significant in the upcoming elections, the factor of the economy. You already see many Democrats becoming more emboldened. For example, they voted to withhold support for his defense budget. And that is pretty much a risky thing in American politics, because you can be accused of being a traitor for not supporting the troops and so on. But they're basically standing up to him. If he loses the Senate in November, he'll probably lose the House of Representatives, the lower house. That will probably happen. But if he loses the Senate as well, that will solidify his status as a lame duck. It will basically make him a placeholder president. He'll have the ability to pursue wars, so to speak, but his domestic agenda will be dead on arrival.
If Iran or its regional allies were to disrupt both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, how significant would this impact be on global energy markets, international shipping, and also economies of major oil imports?
It would be very significant, Ellie, because we're in a situation right now where the damage to the Strait of Hormuz being closed has been in part mitigated in the recent months because of the Saudi shift of oil resources towards the Red Sea ports and the use of the pipeline across the Arabian Peninsula to just bring down a little bit of the impact of the closure. If the Bab el-Mandeb is also closed, wouldn't necessarily, of course, affect exports and imports to and from Europe and the Mediterranean, but it would definitely further impact Asia, because that's the only way of getting the Arabian Peninsula oil out of the Saudi oil wells into the reserves of those Asian countries that are very dependent on the Gulf for their energy supplies. And then there's the issue of shipping. The Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez Canal, they're kind of tied at the hip. And it's not just about oil, it's about all sorts of stuff, everything from automobiles to air conditioners to plastic toys that you get for your kids, going around the world in these big, huge container ships, go through that passageway. And if it were also closed, that would, in a way, the closure of the Bab el-Mandeb will have far more of an impact on global shipping than the closure of the Strait of Hormuz does.
And the United States says its strikes are intended to reduce Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping. And while Iran argues it is responding to US military pressure and the naval blockade that they have put on, is there still a viable diplomatic off-ramp, or have both sides entered a cycle of retaliation that will be increasingly difficult to contain now?
I think there's still a viable diplomatic roadmap. The problem is there's just no trust. There's no trust in the U.S. Because they keep changing their position and keep changing their stance. Their rationale for the war just keeps changing. Their goals just keep publicly changing. And there's no trust in Iran because I think in many respects, the Washington political discourse is so polluted by outside interests and lobbies that have manipulated the Trump administration and planted this sort of dark spirit inside the administration against Iran. There's also the history of bad relations between Iran and the U.S. that contributes to that. So if some sort of deal were to come out and some sort of off-road were to be implemented, it would have to come through some kind of diplomatic negotiation that would be born of trust. The idea was in the memorandum of understanding that you build up this trust by giving and taking a little bit. But even during that memorandum of understanding period, there was basically violations on both. But I got to say, especially on the U.S. side, they signed a document saying that they would end the conflict in Lebanon, for example, and they never ended it. They signed a document that says basically that Iran has a measure of control over the Strait of Hormuz, and then they never acknowledged that. So I think that the Trump administration signed something that it didn't quite understand in a hurry and then failed to abide by any of its provisions.
With attacks on commercial vessels increasing and concerns growing over the security of key maritime choke points, what additional measures can regional navies and international maritime coalitions take to protect civilian shipping without further escalating the conflict, without any more innocent civilians getting hurt in this situation?
Well, they can freeze shipping, and that's basically what a lot of these companies will do. These are immensely risk-averse companies running these ships. They're not well armed or anything like that. Maybe they can fend off a few Somali pirates in speedboats, but to fend off a ballistic missile from a second or third rank military power, a global regional power, would not be so easy. And so I think that there's very little they can do to mitigate the risk, short of just staying put and not moving their ships through these volatile choke points. And now on to the special segment on Libya. Part 2, I'll broadcast sometime in the next day or two, maybe even tomorrow. So the nation of Libya has been in the news lately after falling off of the headlines for a little bit. It's not really that big of a news story right now. I think it somewhat should be. It's just that there's so much else happening in the world right now. Libya was one of the Arab countries that experienced enormous political change during the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings, as they were called, the Arab Spring. And it has sort of become this unequivocal, largely accepted truth that Libya was a disaster, that it was this example of a U.S. and NATO-led regime change war that led to nothing but bad things, that the regime under Muammer Gaddafi, the former longtime dictator, brought stability to the country, and that now the country is run by jihadis and is like the common thing that I always hear from the United States and NATO overthrew Gaddafi only to install slave markets in Libya and turn it into a country run by crazed fanatics, into a walking disaster. That is very far from the truth. Although Libya has many, many problems. I actually know quite a bit about Libya. I actually am one of the few people who have been in Libya under Muammar Gaddafi's regime. I was there when Gaddafi was in charge during a brief trip before the revolution. I think it was like 2009, I want to say. And then I was in both Tripoli during the war with the Gaddafi regime as my host, so to speak. I interviewed Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the son and former heir apparent of the Libyan regime, who I think he is now dead. He's been killed apparently since his capture by rebel forces. And I also spent a lot of time with the rebels as they prepared to take over Tripoli, as well as in Libya after the conflict. I've been to the east of Libya. I've been to the west of Libya. The capital, Tripoli, is in the northwest. I've been to the south of Libya. I've been to the center of Libya. I've spent a lot of time there, although I haven't been there in a few years. And indeed, there are a lot of problems there. Would Libya be better off right now if it was under the control of Muammar Gaddafi or one of his sons, Saif al-Islam, probably? Perhaps it would have been better off, and perhaps it was a mistake to support the uprising. But at the time, during the revolution, it was a time of big change in Libya and across North Africa. The revolution started in Tunisia in January of 2011, when a popular uprising, backed eventually by the army, ousted the longtime ruler, Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali, and brought in place a messy democracy that has now turned into something like a former military rule. Libya has always been really super interesting to me as a country. It defies a lot of stereotypes. It's not what people think. It did even have at some point an ISIS problem. There was a presence of ISIS in certain parts of the country, and different bands, different factions in the country banded together to try to get rid of this ISIS problem with U.S. help, and that was effective, actually. And eventually the country kind of also split apart into something like a civil war with foreign powers intervening. Turkey intervened on behalf of the Tripoli-based government of the somewhat Islamist-leaning, but not really, government of the Western Libya, and the United Arab Emirates, Russia, to some extent France, and Egypt back the strongman Khalifa Haftar in the east of the country. And eventually, because of the Turkish superior drone capabilities and military power, Khalifa Haftar was put into check as he was trying to take over the country. He was not able to take over the country, and his project failed. But now there's recently been apparently talks between Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and not Khalifa Haftar, but Saddam Haftar, Khalifa Haftar's son and possible heir apparent to his political network and military network. Meanwhile, there's also reports that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is conferring with Saddam Haftar, as well as reports that lots and lots of energy companies are rushing into Libya to take advantage of that country's huge oil and gas reserves. Libya is sparsely populated. Only like maybe 4 million people live in this vast country, one of the largest in Africa, one of the largest in the world. Most of the people are close to the coast, the northern Mediterranean coast, and very few people live in the vast desert interior. There are a few cities as well in the south, and there is a connection to sub-Saharan Africa. There are Tuareg peoples. There are also Tebu peoples in the south that are connected to Chad. It is a much more diverse country than people give it credit for. While it's mostly Sunni Islam, there are a large number of Amazigh or Berber people who have their own cultural traditions and not necessarily beliefs, but different folkloric ways and different costume and a different lifestyle. And they identify throughout North Africa, including in Tunisia and Morocco and neighboring Algeria. And we're joined now by Anas Al-Gomati. He is the founder and director of the Sadegh Institute, a think tank that is focused on affairs in Libya. Anas, thank you so much. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Borzo. Thanks for having me.
I guess let's just start with the news. So there's this 15th anniversary thing that we could address, like looking back at this uprising and the change of regime there. But as well as this, sudden interest in Libya, we've had a few little data points, and many of them involve Saddam Haftar, Khalifa Haftar, this very toxic, very divisive, polarizing figure who nonetheless controls the eastern half of the country. And no one wants to deal with him, but it seems like some people don't mind dealing with his son, including Marco Rubio and, surprise of surprise, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is in many ways the most prominent backer of the Western government that is opposed to Haftar's enclave in the east. Can you just let's just start with that. Why is Libya all of a sudden garnering new attention? Is it just about the oil?
I think the oil is the best reason why everybody always comes back to Libya. Only a few months ago we had this new EPSA, energy pairing sharing agreement, that was signed in Libya. There's a lot of renewed interest. ConocoPhillips is back, ExxonMobil is in, Total Energies is deepening its relationship with Libya. But there was around $20 billion worth of deals that had been signed. So there's a long-term commitment now to the Libyan economy, to growing the oil infrastructure at a time, obviously, of course, as you noted, with the Strait of Hormuz and a choking point that is happening across European energy markets, not only because of what was happening in Iran, but also what has been happening in the backdrop of the Ukraine invasion over the last several years. So energy security is like a big reason why, there's always renewed interest from the West. But I guess on this deal, it's being noted and penned as a unification deal. It's really a family merger between these two rival families.
It's a proposed
controlled Libya.
It's a proposed deal at this point, correct? It's not really a done deal.
Well, the deal has been essentially, it's done because there were two families that are essentially in control of Libya. And if you want to get a context of where Libya has been.
Sure, yes, please. Let's get deep into the details.
Happy to. And roughly speaking, I still remember when we had coffee in Tripoli in 2014, and I remember being with a pen and paper trying to sketch out the two rival factions. We could go back to that pad of paper, and I don't think much hasn't changed. Much hasn't changed since those 11 years since we had coffee in Tripoli. And unfortunately, there are two rival factions that have divided Libya largely over the last 15 years, really over the last decade. Since 2014, there was a civil war that emerged in May 2014. It was a war on terror that was declared by this aging retired general Khalifa Haftar. Khalifa Haftar is notable amongst Libyans and those that watch the region. But to those that don't know him, he is a Libyan general that came up with Muammer Gaddafi in 1969 in the coup that overthrew the former king of Libya. He then defected from Gaddafi after he was sent to Chad in a war that just dissolved into chaos in 1986. He defected to the CIA, was shipped out of Chad in the late 80s, brought to Virginia, where he rested in just a few kilometers from Langley, Virginia, for 20 years as a CIA asset, came back in 2011 to take control of the Libyan revolutionary armed groups from Benghazi in eastern Libya, failed to do so. And wherever his failings come, unfortunately, you have not only just baggage of mass assassinations wherever he goes, assassinations kind of follow, the assassination of his clearest rival in 2011, but in 2014 there were mass assassinations in Benghazi, only a year and a half after the murder and the death of Ambassador Stevens to the United States ambassador to Libya. And he declared this war on terror. Libya was kind of ripe at that time, gripped by fear, gripped by all of this paralysis and its political transition. And he took the West on board with this new fear, not an aspiration for democracy and political transition that had taken place after 2011, but this new fear of we have to defeat the terrorists. We have to stop the assassinations. And the assassinations have continued. And since then, he's gone from a toehold in Benghazi in eastern Libya to controlling not just half the country, as you've declared in terms of geographics. He does control half the country, but perhaps a bit more, but he controls the lifeline to the country. He controls the oil fields that sit in the center of the country and in the southwest of the country. He also controls much of the economy. Not only does he just control the oil, he prints his own money. He prints money in Russia, imports it into Libya, has his own printing press that sits under a commercial bank, apparently, in eastern Libya, and prints a second currency in the country. And he controls a military force that is, in over 70% of the country. So he has a lot of the controlling levers, and he has the diplomatic connections that matter. And not only the connections to the CIA, he has very, very well-known connections to Russia, and he has built those connections not only over the last decade, but over 50 years. So he's a bit like Pinocchio, but with more strings. Yeah. And the strings, unfortunately, as many as you can, they start with the United States and Russia. They include Egypt, the United Arab Emirates as well. But they have also now included his former foe, especially the Emirates. Yeah, I mean, they were his first backer in that war on terror that essentially sparked the civil war and split all of these institutions. And they've been largely split over the last decade. So you have two rival governments in East and West. You've had two rival parliaments that have been involved in legislation and never agree. In fact, they kind of agree to disagree over elections and then agree to share the wealth with their two patrons. Either the Dbeibeh family, which is now in control of Western Libya, has been in control for the last 4.5, 5 years, but also the Haftar family that has been around, as I said, for decades, but has really been on the scene for the last 11 years. So that's kind of the state of play today in Libya, these two rival families controlling much of the political economy. And the US is just putting a blessing on a family merger, but It's not really a unification plan, as I would say it.
Right. It's a family blessing between the Dbeibeh family and that is a Tripoli family or a Misrata family, out of curiosity.
They are a Misratan family. I wouldn't say that they have so much traction in Misrata. I think the point when using a lot of these names, and I think you see them when you come to Syria, you talk about Aleppo and you talk about Damascus, you talk about different regions of the countries. I think the regions become known for the military posture and political posture of the major armed groups that have emerged. The major armed groups in Misrata and in western Libya, particularly around Tripoli, particularly around the Western Mountains, the Nafusa Mountains, where you have the Amazigh indigenous communities of Libya, but also the Misratan families as armed groups. Most of them disagree on a lot of things, but they actually agree on not returning to family rule as it was under Gaddafi, and certainly not under family rule, whether it's Dbeibeh or whether it's Haftar. So I think, he has his patronage is from that city, but I don't think his politics is reflective of that city today.
Does Dbeibeh right now? Does he have position in the West?
Yeah, I mean, he's the prime minister of the Government of National Unity. That's the second UN-backed government that has emerged from two unfortunate failed UN experiments with Libya to kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So he's there, and his tenure now over 4 years, 5 years of not holding elections, it's become tenuous. He doesn't have the backing of the international community where it matters diplomatically, politically, militarily. So he's kind of been forced into a corner, like every other UN-backed government is forced into a corner of doing business with Haftar. And I think it's essentially going to be a business deal that is going to underpin this. but there are two families and neither trust each other. And you can see this being played out in Libyan media, where they have their feeder channels, where they have their Facebook channels. And as much as they stand for, secret meetings with Mas'ad Boulos, the US envoy to Libya, and they have these little moments in the military exercises, for example, that took place in central Libya this year, the US military exercise, Flintlock. They'll have these exercises publicly, and then privately and quasi-publicly through their media channels, absolutely tear each other apart. So it's kind of like living in the upside down. If you're so ripe for peace, then why are you slamming each other and tearing each other down in your media pages and your media channels? So I don't think there's necessarily going to be the kind of the key litmus test for, does this actually bring around peace? Peace requires cooperation and actually working together and integrating together. I didn't see that on the battlefield when they did this Flintlock exercise a few months ago. They essentially came and they attended the same lunch and brought their own picnics. They didn't integrate their comm systems. They didn't merge their military units together. They were just symbolically there in the same patch of work. And the Americans came back and called it a deal. Now, to go back to your original question about Rubio, this is coming off the back of a failed attempt at overthrowing the Iranian regime, trying to get a peace deal that they didn't put together, the Pakistanis and the Qataris put together. And I think it's definitely the fastest deal that I've ever seen. And it's, the fastest deal is not always the right deal.
The best deal.
It's not the best deal. It's the cheapest one on offer. And they want to come out of this.
You think that they're and that makes sense, because it seems like everything that the Trump administration has been doing and involved with is sort of on the cheap, like the Temu version of everything, the Temu version of this reflecting pool in Washington, the Temu version of any kind of seriousness with regard to the Supreme Court and the legal decisions, and the Temu version of diplomacy, which includes this memorandum of understanding that neither country is abiding by in the Persian Gulf, and this cheapo deal that appears to be trying to stitch Libya back together, but you're saying not really.
Yeah, look, I mean, honestly, I wouldn't even borrow. I will borrow an analogy and go one step further. It's dollar store diplomacy. Honestly, I mean, these are dollar store diplomacy. I mean, these are like cheapskates.
Dollar store.
And
not even Temu.
They're not even Temu, honestly.
Forget Alibaba, not even Temu, just that, dollar store.
Okay. At least shipping's $1.99. It's higher than their payroll. But people like Mas'ad Boulos, the US envoy to Libya, to Sudan, they're doing deals on the side. I mean, Mas'ad Boulos' son, Michael Boulos, absolutely, to enriching themselves. They were sitting on the yacht of the oil brokers that are siphoning off Libya's oil during these deals.
You mean like any?
Like there's a deal. There is essentially a.
Eni, by the way, in case you don't know, is like the big Italian state-backed oil company. So go ahead.
No, this is actually a Turkish company that is based in the United Arab Emirates and Geneva. It's called BGN. And
sounds
the owners
legit.
Of that yacht, sounds super. Chef's kiss. I mean, it's just
the countries that you mentioned: Turkey, UAE, Switzerland.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so that there is the fact that Michael Boulos, the son of Mas'ad Boulos, is partying on this yacht of the owners of the very brokers that sell Libya's stolen oil from Saddam Haftar's own company that he set up with Ibrahim Dbeiba, the nephew of the prime minister. I mean, when I call it family merger, I'm not, I'm not just joking about it. I'm not using it like flippantly.
Our dads hate each other, but hey, man, we can still party together on this yacht. I get what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, look, money brings people together, and I think that there's a degree of people sitting there thinking, wow, it's like watching a football match. Libyans are just the spectators, and they're having this game played in front of them. But when they leave, in fact, it's not even a football match. It's like watching WWF wrestling, right, from the 90s. They will hammer each other in the ring, and then when they leave, the crowd is going crazy. And when they get to the locker room, they put their arms around one another and say, do you think they bought it? It's such a cheap form of politics. That it's almost laughable if it wasn't so tragic, because the tragedy is that Libya, as we've just discussed, it's getting richer, right? I mean, they're moving up. Oil has never been as high as it has been over the last year. There is such a renewed interest in Libya that all of this money is not trickling down into their pockets, into the Libyan pockets. Libyans are getting much poorer, and they have been getting much poorer over the last 15 years, but they have never been this poor. 28% of the Libyans now, according to the WFP, have a basket that they can't afford, like a bread basket they can't afford anymore. So a third of the population that was well known to be probably the most, I would say one of the most generous kind of rentier packages, in the entire MENA region. So it's sad to think that Libyans are getting poorer, that they have this kind of rentierism that they were actually trying to move away from. But now most of that money is being enriched and put into the pockets of these two rival families. And I think it's sad that the US is blessing a deal that is making Libyans poorer, that is making these two families richer, and is actually not going to bring around peace. I mean, by any stretch of the imagination, I mean, even if you were Rubio and you were saying, well, some of these guys like Bullos are going to get rich, I think Trump is interested in sticking it to Hillary on this one and saying, look, you messed it up and I fixed it. On all of those different brokers, if you brought in the DOD right now in Pentagon and you said, well, they also have Russian Wagner mercenaries that the UAE brought with them in 2020.
Are they still there?
They are still there. I mean, they're still in Jufra, central Libya, in Sirte, and towards southeastern Libya.
And doing what? Like, if I may ask, the Russians are doing oil security. Is that what they're doing?
Well, they have at times. They were in the oil fields, but they're doing something much more treacherous and much more evil. Honestly, I mean, I don't like using terms like that unless I'm being very specific.
What are they doing?
But them and the Emirates are funneling in weapons and mercenaries every single day and fuel. $20 billion worth of Libyan subsidized fuel that was stolen from 2022 to 2024, according to the Century Report, has flowed out of the country, but most of it is going into Sudan. It's fueling one of the worst civil wars and worst genocides. For the RSF, for Hemeti.
For the RSF.
Yeah, absolutely, for Hemeti. So, I mean, This is one of those things where, as a Libyan, you realize that your natural wealth is also fueling one of the most, if not the worst, war in memory. I mean, I can't think of a war like the one in Sudan. 12 million people displaced, hundreds of thousands that have been killed, never meeting the headlines because they're the wrong color, they're the wrong nationality, they're the wrong ethnicity. I mean, that's the sad truth of what's happening in Sudan. And they're getting away with it in the very same week that Rubio was talking about a need to bring the actors together in Sudan. He's literally shaking hands with the very actor that is fueling every single tank, every single bullet that is in Sudan, that is fueling the RSF, is coming through Libya. Wow. And all of the gold, the billions of dollars of gold that has been smuggled out of that country is going and clearing Libyan customs. Out of Sudan, yeah. It's clearing Libyan customs, clearing Haftar's hands, and it hits the Abu Dhabi Gold Exchange. Yeah, going into shell accounts for the Russians, for the Emiratis, for Hemeti, for Haftar. These are people that are getting rich off human misery. I mean, it's the worst kind of wars because the richer they get, the worse the suffering is.
Let's talk a little bit about Libyan people, the ordinary Libyan people, as you referred to it. Now I want to shift back to the politics of it as well. But have you been able to travel to Libya recently?
Yeah, I was there a few months ago. I go back as often as I can. And every time I go back, I'm saddened by the situation because to me, Libya it's covered in crime scene tape. The whole country is covered in crime scene. I can't look at a single wall, a single street where I don't think war crimes were committed here, tanks were falling through here. There are still craters that are covering the ground where Haftar's troops came, where the rival factions, because both factions have been involved in these horrible crimes, but these crimes that have been committed, particularly since 2014, are the worst types of crimes because I would say, under Gaddafi, those crimes, the West was watching, and Gaddafi was very careful about that. He had tried to put on the uniform of reform for the decade before the revolution and was very careful of what he did during the revolution. The majority of Gaddafi's crimes were pre-revolution, and he knew the West was watching in 2011, and so he didn't commit the major crimes that he had committed in the 90s, the thousands that he'd killed in prisons and political, but he wasn't committing that as much during the revolution. But the ones that have taken part since 2014, the West wasn't watching. The West was participating. The UN was giving a clean blank slate to Khalifa Haftar on April 4th. And I'll give you an anecdote for this. The UN envoy, Ghassan Salama, who is now a minister in the Lebanese government in Beirut, he was the UN envoy to Libya. And on April 4th, when Khalifa Haftar struck Tripoli, it was when Antonio Guterres, the UN chief, was in Tripoli. He left with a tweet and said, good luck, essentially, to the Libyans. I hope you guys stop what you're doing. In the days that followed, it was Ghassan Salama that came on NPR and said, the UN Security Council has stabbed me in the back. It's the UN Security Council members that were the ones that threatened on April 9th in Rome that they would veto any attempt, not just to sanction Khalifa Haftar from what he was doing, but to criticize him for what he was doing. He was praised in the UN press statements that came out afterwards. This is someone that is not just doing it with the West watching. The West is participating.
And you're talking about
weapons that are coming through.
You're talking about what year were you talking about there? Was that
2019 was the last attempt.
I remember.
Yeah. So John Bolton, the Secretary of Defense at the time, I think he's the Secretary of Defense at the time in 2019, there was a phone call between him and Haftar essentially asked permission from the Americans to launch a coup on Tripoli. And his words, according to the New York Times, were,
I remember. Yeah.
if you're going to do it, make it quick.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not only encouragement, it's don't embarrass us. And this is someone that has been around for decades failing. He didn't make it quick. He made it long and he made it brutal and he brought in the Russians
And he
with
lost.
him. And he lost. And this is the sadness of pathetically lost, but has taken more from negotiations than he could have done through war. So I don't know why we refer to this man as a strong man. He's like a plastic strong man. He's a strong enough man.
Yeah.
But he's only made strong enough by those that back him. And the Americans are backing someone that they have a long working relationship with, but is also working with the Russians. The Russians are still in Libya now and are getting the oils, they're getting the cogs kind of glistened by this oil that the Americans are pouring onto this machine, that they are enriching themselves from, that they are increasing the suffering from. And from a NATO perspective, NATO has two flanks. The southern flank is Libya and the eastern flank is Ukraine. All of this, Europe well. I mean, if you go to Brussels, you can't walk into a bathroom without finding a Ukrainian flag on the door.
Yeah.
Right? Everywhere you go, because the Russians are here, the Russians are there. The Russians are in Libya doing all of this stuff with the European blessing.
Yeah.
They sit there applauding when they go to eastern Libya. European diplomats, Western diplomats, American diplomats, British diplomats applauding.
Really?
Sanctions busting. Yeah, they sit there. You can see it for yourself.
Yeah.
You can fact check this yourself. I'm not making these things up. They sit there during the ceremonies for Khalifa Haftar, who literally brings in Russian weaponry, Russian aircraft, Emirati
You know about
sanctions
that, but
busting weapons.
I'm at the applause.
And they're applauding that they're sitting there, sipping their macchiatos, saying, "Isn't this great? We love the Mediterranean." I mean, this is the same individuals that go back to Brussels and say, "Yeah, we got to stop that pesky Wagner group or the Africa Corps or Putin's men that are now in Ukraine." What do you do? You're walking in the same corridors with them in Eastern Libya.
Yeah. Wait, and you're supporting this mechanism that supports this ongoing genocide and horrific war crimes in Sudan as well, through the conduit of the UAE and Libya. But like getting back to ordinary people's lives, I mean, are people's salaries being paid, or is there unemployment is a problem? What is this? Let's take a place like let's say not the nice section of Tripoli. Let's say Bani Walid. How is that place doing? For example,
I would even hazard and give you the nice section of Tripoli, and start with that because that's really important. The middle class that was in Libya has been decimated. There was a middle class. There was one that existed under Gaddafi. As someone that despised Gaddafi myself, make no qualms about it. I'm not someone that would lie about the situation in 2011. There was a middle class in Libya. That has now disappeared because of the erosion of the value of the dinar. The Libyan dinar was one of the strongest currencies in the MENA region. $1 gave you 1.3 dinars, right? Over the last 15 years, it has been eroded so much that it's worth, at times, almost today, a tenth of its value, right? What do you do to someone that was sitting on assets of $1 million plus, when now their entire family is worth less than 100 grand? What mobility do you have? What kind of life do you have? For those that were sitting at the bottom of the pile, and there was a lot of the bottom of the pile under Gaddafi, that were living off a rentier welfare state, the system does not work for them. The health and education system does not work for them. People can't get, school books and textbooks, right?
Wow.
I mean, that's the first thing. The fact that they can't get access to petrol to fill up their car to even get to their job is one that is an astonishing irony for a country that pumps 1.5 million barrels a day and only has 6-7 million people as a population to not be able to even get the oil in to be able to fill up your tank. There's another astonishing one, but the value of your currency, if you're being paid a salary from the state and the majority of the Libyan population is on the state payroll, if you're, the value of a 2,000 dinar salary back in 2011 did something for you. Today, 2,000 dinars is like $230, $240. What do you do with that? How do you take care of a family with that? People are just trying to make ends meet. Now, the real sadness of this, to my mind, is that the majority of those problems are problems of an artificial nature. The majority of this money that is being stolen, the oil wealth that Libya has been stolen. The subsidized fuel that is brought into the country is siphoned off by the majority of the actors, but including and most notably Saddam Haftar, who trickles that into Sudan to fuel a genocide, whilst his people can't even fill up their petrol tanks. The money is being inflated and is deteriorating because they're printing their own currency. They're printing their own currency. It's worth nothing. And, the acid test is that the Libyan dinar cannot be pegged by the central bank. There are two currency rates in the country. They can't keep up with each other. The black market rate is just terrible. It's what the average Libyan gets. The majority of the goods that are bought by Libyans are bought by these middlemen that work for the ruling parties in East and West Libya. They bring carrier worths of goods that are empty. That's been the case now for the last decade. Now, the worst, and I think that one of the worst situations is that on every level of service delivery that the state is supposed to provide, it is failing and nothing is being done about it. If the central bank is supposed to be looking at how to get more value to the Libyan dinar, they can't because they're constantly put into meetings with Americans talking about how to merge the two central banks together, how to pay off the debts of the two rival factions, particularly the Eastern faction that ran up a bill of nearly $30 billion paying for mercenaries and smuggling in fuel and smuggling in weapons. I mean, like, all of that money is being paid for the crime scene tape that I see everywhere else, that the value goes to nothing. Electricity in a country that has the size of the Sahara, what you could do with it.
Is that happening?
Power outages are so regular. I mean, Debeba came in with a promise that he was going to end that. It's never ended. There are power outages in the east. There are power outages in the west. None of the money is being paid for critical infrastructure. Now, we should also go into the deepest context, which is that there was a massive dam, the two dams that burst on September 11, 2023, only shortly before the events of what happened on October 7th and the genocide in Palestine. But essentially, that was robbed from the headlines. These two dams that burst, these aging dams in Eastern Libya, killed near on 11,000 people in minutes, right? On September 11, 2023. That was the biggest acid test for the reason why corruption is one of these visceral things that ends lives. It's not that you just get poorer, it ends lives, right? In the moments that happened afterwards, the days that happened afterwards, the Eastern Parliament that is controlled by Khalifa Haftar gave a blank check of tens of billions of dollars to Khalifa Haftar's son, Belgasim, to open a reconstruction fund for Libya. That has been going on now for the last 3 years. That money is going into his pockets and paying for a lick of paint here and a few light bulbs there to open up things. I was speaking with shortly after this took place, I was speaking with a businessman from Tripoli who openly and pragmatically goes to Eastern Libya to do business. And he proposed a project. He told me, he said, I proposed the project to work on critical infrastructure for the roads so that we don't flood them anymore. And they literally told him in the meeting, we don't want that because it doesn't photograph well enough on Instagram. We want stuff that photos well, that we can applaud. So they built a stadium and renovated a stadium in Eastern Libya. They have built or finished some of the homes the Gaddafi regime had already built to 80% and was finishing them off. Now, the tragedy is some of those contracts have to still be paid to the companies that Gaddafi signed with. So we're going to pay for them twice. Once to have to put in his own pockets, once to the companies that didn't finish the work. But it's tens of billions of dinars, tens of billions of dollars, in fact, that have been paid that haven't even touched critical infrastructure. It was last month that Belgasim Haftar came on television and said, I haven't even begun to work on the infrastructure yet, so don't judge me yet. So what have you spent these billions of dollars on? Do you know what you could do with a country when you have those billions? And you can only build the infrastructure and build the country once. And they have used it essentially for a coronation, for the succession of the Haftar family. Each one of his sons is now, positioning themselves to get into a position for the future of that family. So the dynasty is either going to be sitting as president, as Saddam Haftar, Belgasim potentially as the businessman that will be involved in ruling the state's affairs and its investments overseas and at home. He has a son that's a poet who essentially goes off sometimes as an emissary to Hameti and whispers in his ear in Sudan. He's the chairman of a club, Marikh football club in Sudan. He has another son that is the head of the army. He has another son that is the head of Libyan tech, the Libyan Bitcoin and digital transformation. I mean, all of it is a joke. None of it is tangible. None of it you
all
can
the
touch and
family
feel.
business. It's like basically
It's a family business.
Yeah. So if this is a Temu piece, he's the Temu Gaddafi in a way.
Temu Gaddafi. Yeah, honestly, poor dollar store version of Gaddafi. I mean, honestly, the fact that he has so many different currencies behind him. I mean, he's not the Libyan dinar version. It's definitely like he's either rubles, dinars, or Emirati dirhams, but he's definitely not a Libyan version of it because Libyans didn't create that monster that we see in front of us and one that has brought the country to its needs. He was created in essentially a foreign scheme, and that's the sadness of what is happening today because I don't hold Libyans accountable for what they did. I hold the West and I hold the Arab partners for what they did afterwards.
So what do you think of Recep Tayyip Erdogan meeting with Saddam Haftar? What is that all about? Is basically they're saying, hey, is Turkey just acknowledging what power, who is the real power in Libya? Or is there another calculation? Or is there basically Turkey trying to protect its considerable investments in Libya?
Well, it has a meta investment that we shouldn't forget, which is that it signed a maritime deal with the formerly UN-backed government in Tripoli in late 2019 in exchange for it to come in and prop up that government when it was under attack from Haftar and when the UN failed to stop that attack. When it signed that deal, it was essentially putting together a geopolitical knot that it's had for decades now with the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Israelis and the Cypriots, and essentially the Lebanese over control and authorship of the massive gas deposits that are in the East Mediterranean. So for its own future, this is the Mavi homeland doctrine that the Turks have now worked on for decades. That was the final piece in that chess puzzle. Now, the problem with that is that it signed it with a government, not with a parliament. And for it to be ratified in Libya, it needs to be done with the parliament. Problem with the parliament is that it's controlled by Khalifa Haftar in Eastern Libya. So they have essentially chosen a side, but they haven't chosen the right side for their deal. Now, secondly, I would say the reason why they have started working with both sides is that both sides in Libya are already working with each other.
I see.
Right? This idea of a division, so they're playing the same game that everyone else is, and they're trying to secure their investment. And the third, honestly, is this is essentially a time where I don't think Turkey can afford more geopolitical opponents. It has enough. I wouldn't forget the words of Naftali Bennett and other Israeli politicians that have essentially said after Iran, I think even it was a famous, I think it might have been TV News 12 in Israel, but I would rather get the fact right, but came on television and said, essentially the semi-finals are Iran, but the final is Turkey. So they have enough problems in the region already with Israel and with other actors that they've been putting to bed for the last 4 or 5 years, especially the UAE, the Saudis. They've been trying to put those things to bed. I don't think they can fight on all fronts. I don't think they want to. They have now got a cooperative relationship with the Egyptians and the Emiratis, and they're trying to say, look, let's kick down our problems down the road, because I think they will deal with them later. And I wouldn't say, now I'm glad that you asked the question, I wouldn't say it's any different to the kind of deals that they were doing with Bashar al-Assad. They were on the verge of doing a deal, a pragmatic deal with Bashar al-Assad after 15 years of zero pragmatism. And they were on the verge of doing that. And when the opportunity came to overthrow Bashar, they did. I don't think, and this is something that I think is deeper to, Turkish political culture, I genuinely don't see how Turkey, in the current form that it's in now, over its last 100 years of having coup after coup after coup, and emerging with civilian governance, whether it be under the AKP and Erdogan, or under anyone else or any other party, because they have a richer political culture, I would say, than the rest of the MENA region. They actually call coups coups and revolutions revolutions. They don't mistake them for what they are. The problem, I think, for for Turkey is that it cannot cooperate with these military-backed regimes, because existentially, they don't like having a Turkey that sits as an example in the region of what the Democrats could become, what a civilian state would look like. And I would say that Libya is chief amongst them. For the majority of the regional Arab states, particularly the Egyptians and particularly the Emiratis, that invested deeply in returning Libya back to an authoritarian regime, the central question is why? And the central question is that if Libya was to emerge as an oil-producing democracy, what would that democracy look like? Well, it wouldn't look like an Egyptian or a Tunisian one, because they're poor. They don't discuss the same things as a rich oil-producing democracy like Libya would. Libya is tribal. The UAE is tribal. Libya is federal. The UAE is a federal state as well. And it would have these kind of discussions about returning stolen wealth, putting it back into the Libyan pockets, making sure that we don't go off and buy Da Vinci's and super yachts with them. And I think that's one of the main reasons. And Turkey, for a long time, for many Libyans that go there and do business, and Libya is one of those places that Turks can easily visit and vice versa, Turkey looked like a model of what that could look like. And I think for many, and it looked like a model that was functioning when it's poor, not just when it's rich. So I think for many, there is a problem, a deeper problem there. That's one that the UAE and the Egyptians were certainly worried about, and they didn't want anyone borrowing the Turkish playbook of trying to stop those coups from happening. But I think that it's one that will put them on a crash course eventually. So I think today, the Turks are being really pragmatic about sending and selling drones essentially to Eastern Libya, which they are today, and working with both sides. But I think when push comes to shove, the other side will make their calculation about the Turks. And the question is, who has who for lunch before the other has them for dinner? So I think it's a deeper question. But the Turks are involved. They're certainly the kingmaker today when it comes on the military level on the ground. Yeah. But it's such a crowded place that it's hard for me to say that without loads of caveats. So are the Russians. So are the Emiratis. So are the Egyptians.
Hey, thanks for listening in or watching. I'm Orzu Dergahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe at orzu.substack.com or at Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or on YouTube.